All right, so on March 2nd, I'm starting my new sermon series, and this is a series on the Psalms of Ascent. So I want to talk about what the Psalms of Ascent are, why I'm preaching them, and why I'm excited about them. So the Psalms, most people may not know this, but the Psalms are divided up into 5 separate books. Somewhere along the way, who knows when or where, but somewhere along the way, someone took the Psalms and organized them into 5 separate books. And these books range from pretty long, like 109, I think, to 150 is the last book, to short. Some of them are pretty short, but there's 5 total books. And within those books, there are segments or sections that belong together. For example, the Hallel Psalms are 113 to 118, and those were sung typically after Passover. So the Hallel Psalms would have been what Jesus sang after the Last Supper as he went out to the Garden of Gethsemane before he was captured by Judas. He would have sung those 6 Psalms, 113 to 118. So when it says that in Matthew, they went out singing, that's what it would have been. So, and also Psalm 103 through 106 or 107 kind of belong in a chunk together. Well, the Psalms of Ascent are Psalm 120 through 134, and they belong together. They all begin with that same phrase, a psalm or a song of ascent. And there's a lot of debate about what that's about, why are they titled that, but all 15 of those begin with the exact same phrase in the title. And most people think today, there's been a lot of conjecture throughout history, but most people think today they were songs that were sung by the Israelites as they went up to Jerusalem for one of their 3 yearly feasts they had to go up there for. So they ascended. Jerusalem was on a mountain. It was on an actual mountain. And so when it says they went up to Jerusalem, they literally went up the hill to Jerusalem. So there would be thousands of Israelites all over Israel come into Jerusalem for one of the 3 feasts, and they would sing these 15 psalms. There's also a tradition that the priests sung them as they ascended the 15 steps to the temple. There were 15 steps going up to the temple, so there's a tradition that the priests would sing 1 psalm per step as they climbed up. So there's 15 psalms in these Psalms of Ascent. And they're wonderful psalms. You might wonder, why preach the psalms? Well, why preach these psalms? The psalms are wonderful for the Christian life. They give us a lot of insight in the Christian psychology, in other words, how the Christian heart and mind is supposed to work. Throughout the history of the church, the Psalter has been one of the biggest blessings the church has had. She's sung the Psalter a lot of times in certain circles. Pastors had to memorize all 150 Psalms before they could even be ordained. So there's different things like that. So the Psalms have been a central part of the life of the church since the beginning, since the apostolic era. But preaching through all 150 Psalms is a long process. Probably take you somewhere around 4 to 5 years to preach through all 150 Psalms. So usually what preachers do is they take segments, chunks of Psalms, and preach through them. Some men will preach 10 at a time. I know a pastor preaches 10, and then he takes a break and does some Old Testament, New Testament, and preaches 10 more, later, usually a couple years later. So I thought this would be a great section to preach. It's cohesive, it hangs together, it's all meant to be sung and prayed through and talked about together. It begins with Israel out in the wilderness. The first Psalm, Psalm 120, is about war and how the Israelites are for peace, but these guys are for war, and how it mentions slander and treacherous tongues. So it begins with warfare, us out in the wilderness, us out in the world. And it ends with Psalm 134 with the priest blessing us from the sanctuary. So we move through this whole section where we begin at war, out in the wilderness, among our enemies, and we end in the sanctuary of God, being blessed by the priest, being blessed at Mount Zion. So there's this wonderful sort of a travelogue, if you will, as we go to Jerusalem. So it's a great section to preach. It holds together, and it should be very exciting to do. And I think rather than trying to preach through all 150 Psalms, this is a great way to do it. Now, why am I excited about these? Okay, so let me give you a couple of reasons for that. First of all, a lot of these Psalms are very familiar. They're kind of like, the shirt that you love to wear. You pull down, you're like, this is comfortable. Psalm 122, we sing that. Oh, 'twas a joyful sound. It talks about God's people going up to the temple and being excited to be with one another. Psalm 127 and 128, unless the Lord builds a house, bless the man that fears Jehovah. And then Psalm 130, which is a great psalm of forgiveness. If you, O Lord, should mark iniquities, O Lord, who could stand? But there's forgiveness with you that you may be feared. It's a great psalm of forgiveness. So some of these, Psalm 133, about Christian unity and how we're dwell together in unity. So a lot of these are very familiar to us. So we'll be able to get into some of these more familiar psalms that we sung and maybe even memorize some of us and study them before. We'll get into them, go deeper into them, understand better what they're talking about. But then there's also psalms that are really pretty obscure. and you're like, what is this talking about? What psalm is this? So, for example, Psalm 120 that I just mentioned, all sorts of strange, weird stuff in Psalm 120. Kedar, Meshach, broom trees, arrows, all sorts of weird stuff. What's going on with that psalm? Psalm 132, the longest psalm in there, is about the Ark of the Covenant being brought up. And it's got all these named places, Bethlehem and David and things like that. And probably no one really knows, an average Christian probably doesn't know what's in Psalm 132 and why it's there and what it's talking about. So this section is a wonderful balance of really familiar psalms that we love, we sing, we enjoy, we've known about for most of our Christian life, and then kind of obscure psalms that are a little weird. And so it'll be a wonderful balance of the familiar and the unfamiliar. And I think that's really what you're looking for in a text. And then obviously, the Psalms bring us to Jesus. They always bring us to Christ. And that's been one of the greatest blessings of the Psalter throughout the centuries, is that we see Jesus. So as we work through these 15 Psalms, we'll frequently come to places where Jesus is there. And in big letters, he's there. And we get to see him and know what he's doing, why he's doing it. Gives us a picture of our Savior who's coming. So I think this is going to be a great sort of shot in the arms, different from Matthew, which I finished up back in the fall. Is different from sort of a topical series that I've been doing on the Covenant Home. It's a series focused around Israel's worship and what they did and how we're supposed to worship and how we're supposed to love God and love Jesus. So I think it'll be a real different series than some of the other stuff we've done. And I think it'll be real encouraging for us as a congregation to get into these, to dig into these. And I've got some other things planned as well. We might do some responsive readings. Like instead of just reading it from the Old Testament, have a responsive reading for each of the Psalms so we get to read it. And then obviously we sing several of them. We sing 133, 128, 122. So on the Sundays that I preach, we will sing those Psalms as well. So that'll be should be real exciting and again, real different. So I'm looking forward to it. Again, that starts on March 2nd. So, there you go. All right, how's that?
Perfect.
All right, sweet.
Couldn't be better.